Alrighty, y'all. I'm in the back of the room here, just to give you a little vertigo, you know. All right, so I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Sophia Cox, who is a sustainability advisor with the UKGBC. Sophia works with the cities program at UKGBC, an industry-led body with a mission to radically improve the sustainability of the built environment. Her recent work includes a project to communicate the sustainability of the UK built environment, a resource to help build environment organizations think about how the future will affect their business, and a guide to social value in new development. Everybody, let's welcome Sophia.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Sophia. I'm going to be talking about how, hoping to give an insight into, in the UK, how social value is being used to drive better development. Kind of going over what social value is, why it's such a buzz phrase in UK development, and then what the power we think this agenda has, both proven and sort of potentially in the future. But yes, I work for the UK Green Building Council. There are GBCs all around the world. Some of you might be familiar with the US Green Building Council. We're a bit of a different fish to them. They have a certification scheme called LEED. We don't own the British version of that. Instead, we run programs that are learning programs, we do research, and we do policy on advocacy on sort of key programs. And we do that very much with our members. This is just sort of a sample of some of the members that we have. There's 400 of them in total. And everything we do is with them and on behalf of them. And as you can see, they're a very diverse group. That's something that we do deliberately. It is their diversity which creates the strength of our campaigns. So it's really thanks to them that we do the work that we do. And one of the things that we did with them, Briante very kindly highlighted the fact that our mission is to radically improve the sustainability of the UK built environment. That's always been our mission, but we haven't always had a vision for what that means, which seems a bit ludicrous because what else, how do we know what we're working towards? So in the last couple of years, we created this vision statement with our members. I know that EcoDistricts are obviously a big fans of visions, and I'm sure lots of you within the room have your own. So bear with me, as in I'm sure there's quite a lot of commonalities. But our vision for a more sustainable environment is one that mitigates and adapts to climate change, eliminates waste and maximizes resource efficiency, embraces and restores nature, promotes the health and well-being of people, and creates long-term value for society and improves quality of life. And the work that I do on social value fits sort of within that last bubble. But obviously, because it's a holistic issue, is relevant to the other sections as well. So, what is social value? Or rather, what do I mean by social value? If you're not familiar with the phrase, I know from the past couple of days that most of the people in the room will be very familiar with the concept. It's just the measurement of societal outcomes. Sometimes put in financial terms, sometimes not. And I'll kind of get back to that at the end, sort of what are the difference in the benefits from when we give a financial value versus when we don't. It's not a great phrase. It's very confusing for people in the UK, or has proved very confusing, because it encompasses the environmental, economic, and social. It's just looking at it through the benefit, the lens of the benefit to society. So that's sort of an important thing to highlight. It is helpful, though, I guess, in the term that it very neatly mirrors business value. And that's kind of the point, that we're trying to think of it as something that is as strong as business value and to sit alongside. And then for development, there is a inherently local aspect as well. But hopefully that will be clearer when I sort of go through the drivers. It is also, as I say, one of the big buzz phrases in UK development at the moment. Everyone's talking about it. Not sure everyone knows exactly what it means, but everyone's talking about it, which is a good thing. So I'm just going to go through some of the reasons why people are talking about it, because I think that will help illustrate. The first one, government driver. After the financial crash of 2008, the UK government declared a time of austerity. For those of you not familiar with that term, it means a severe reduction in public spending, so less money for our education system, our health system, our park system, and that has continued. In our latest Tory party conference, Theresa May announced the end of austerity. I think that might have been a bit precocious. Experts believe that we will, to 2025, have a public spending gap of about 8 billion. So not insignificant, not going away anytime soon. And central government is very aware of that. It is actually their drive in terms of social value to help fill this gap in public spending. So the idea of it is for every pound spent from the public purse, they get extra value for communities around the UK. And they introduced the Social Value Act, Public Services Act. It came into force in early January 2013, which requires that all public sector procurement consider the social value of that contract. Most recently, that's been strengthened. Our civil society strategy, which published in August, set out to strengthen that. So not only do public sector procurement have to consider social value, they also have to account for it. And that's sort of a different nuance because it requires a certain amount of measurement on behalf of that individual. Hence why they've also committed to training up 4,000 civil servants in the measurement of social value. This is all important information because it shows the commitment and direction of travel from central government to this agenda. It's one of the things Theresa May thinks will be one of her legacies, hopefully it'll be one of her positive legacies. So the government stuff. Second is rise of social impact investing. There's always been funds that are ring-fenced for social impact. The interesting thing is they're growing, and we're seeing more institutional investors with those ring-fence funds. The latest figures I have is that the social impact investment money that exists in the UK is around 150 billion and is set to grow. So obviously, with all this money around to be invested, people want to see a social return on investment, so people are going to be, from that community, also measuring social value. The last one, which is very related, is our changing shareholder expectations of business. I don't know if it came across any of your paths, the letter that Larry Fink from BlackRock wrote, which was all around the changing expectations that we have of business. It's not only, it's no longer acceptable just to be financially responsible, we also have to be socially responsible as well. And that has led to an increase in purpose-led organizations. So you're seeing much more private sector businesses talking about how they have a social purpose now. And that sits alongside lots of existing organizations which have always had a social purpose. So say housing organizations, charities, UKGBC being one of those. And increasingly, we are expected to measure the value that you're creating for society and report on that. So that's sort of the third element there. But what's the relevance really to the built environment? I mean, they're just a couple of examples. So public sector procures developers to develop their land. It procures contractors to build their sites. They are all being impacted by the Social Value Act and the expectation that's coming through procurement. In terms of social impact investment, some of the biggest property owners in the UK are very conscious of the fact that there is this money for social impact investing, and they're very aware of the fact that they own big portfolios of buildings that could do with some investment in placemaking between them. So we're seeing a rise in the amount of placemaking on that private land that exists between private portfolios. which is good because I think generally the UK is pretty bad at investing in public realm. And then the last one, purpose-led organizations. This is obviously any contractor, architect, developer who's working on a project. They're going to be thinking more about what added social value they can give through that project. So you can see from what I've just said that those are some of the things that are happening. They're great, but they're not necessarily the most powerful things that can come out of particularly looking at a financial figure for some of these outcomes. So I'm just going to run through 3 examples of case studies that I found from members who we work with that kind of demonstrate what this can really do. The first is from Westminster Council. So Westminster Council, one of the wealthiest councils, is in London. They have a lot of money, they have a lot of social housing, they have a reputation for not being very good at delivering social housing. I won't go into sort of details. This is a particularly contentious site. It's called Ebury Bridge. It has a lot of local residents who are very resistant to the way that it was being developed. So Westminster Council, very progressively, got Hacked, who are a sort of measurement, social value measurement specialist, to create 8 different scenarios and then calculate, so based on the mix of tenures within it. So obviously, Westminster, some factions within Westminster are pushing for it to be private residential, so they can get that capital receipt, whereas other factions are pushing for it to be more social housing because there's such a demand. By creating 8 different scenarios and then calculating for each one the financial value and social value, and of course when you're a local authority, your social value is your financial value. Like, you're going to be paying that at some point in the future anyway. It's just whether you do it now or you wait until the end. And because it was laid out in those terms before them, it created a clear business case for going for scenario 8, which was the one that had the most social housing in it. So a good win. Second one, this is from, so I live in Bristol, it's sort of west of the country, some really great initiatives there. So Bristol is quite a relatively small city. It has lots of pockets of undeveloped land in central Bristol that are actually quite hard to develop. Like, the roads aren't as big as they are here. It's hard to get a construction site going. It's sometimes not viable to do it. And it's public land. It's land owned by the city council. So that's a problem. You've also got a situation in Bristol where there's lots of community activity, lots of activism, lots of people who want to take responsibility for their own situation but don't necessarily have the tools. What they're trying to do, so Bristol and Bath Regional Capital are all around sort of the financing for more sustainable forms of development, like community-led development. And what they're doing is they're creating a calculation methodology which calculates the social value of community-led development. The idea is that once you use that methodology, which is kind of bespoke for community-led housing, you can start spitting out some figures which mean that the local authority can sell off their land to the communities who are going to be doing the development at a discounted price, and that it would be legal to do so because you have put that social value figure alongside the financial value. There are lots of blockers for very reasonable blockers and for local authorities for selling off land for less than market rates. This could be something that allows it to do it in a legal and sustainable way. So a very exciting project, and keeping an eye on how that goes. Lastly, King's Cross development. King's Cross is an area in North London. It used to be the red light district. It was developed, I can't remember, probably about 4 years ago by Argent. No one correct me. but they did a really fantastic job of it. It's now one of the most beautiful places in the city. They transformed the area, and they created a heap load of social value at the same time. I'm not just going to talk about how great they are, because that would be a bit pointless. But in terms of the work that this is quite an interesting example, because this isn't about measuring the financial value in terms of social value. This is about just measuring how effective the social value is. So they created something called Granary Square, which is a beautiful area of placemaking right in the middle of the development. And to anyone looking at it, you think that that was just a 100% total success. But they started measuring the way that it was used, getting feedback from people who actually lived in the area. And what they found was that people from BAME communities, so Black, Asian, minority ethnic, were not using the square. It's a very big square, and the space and the size of it were actually quite an uncomfortable, exposing shape and size for those communities. So they would avoid it and go around the back streets so they didn't have to use it. Not something that would necessarily been picked up if they hadn't have been monitoring the effectiveness of that particular site. So now, because Argent will be working on 2 other key sites coming up in London, they've taken that knowledge with them, they've learned from it, and they're going to be looking to make sure that all of their placemaking in future projects is more inclusive, and that they are representing sort of the placemaking needs of those communities. And hopefully going back to King's Cross and making it a more inviting place for those communities as well. So, the power of measuring social value. I mean, those are obviously some good examples. For me, there's another dimension which is sort of worth reflecting on, particularly for when we're talking about this financial figure, putting a financial figure to the societal outcome. The first benefit is that it actually creates a language for communities to talk to investors with. There is obviously quite a disconnect from those 2 communities. If you start talking in the language of investors, then you start having a more positive dialogue. So that's really important. The second one is that you start attracting funding for things that have quite intangible benefits. So the ones that I really care about, the long-term environmental measures, the benefits of them are not short-term and financial. They're social and in the long term. And it can help us to start recognizing the value of those things, which is great. The last, something that's come up in this conference a lot, funding is always an issue for projects, and often requiring multiple funding to come from multiple places. It is a lot easier to see between a group of stakeholders the amount of money that they should be putting forward for a certain measure, say green infrastructure, if you have a clear outline of what the benefits are for those different stakeholder groups. So the Grantham Institute, which is part of Imperial College in London, is looking at setting up a model that is based on social value for the funding of green infrastructure that they can roll out in cities. So those are sort of all to do with the financial figure side. There are 2 bits as well, which I think coming to EcoDistricts and hearing so much of the content that I have done in the past day and a half, it's been really inspiring because everyone here seems so ahead of these 2 things. But they're not necessarily, I'd say, broadly recognized in the development landscape in the UK. The first is that social value forces you to think in outcomes. And that's really important because we're at the point where people are still thinking in terms of the number of jobs they created on that particular site. So whereas they're not thinking about the long-term impact on that neighborhood for the next 10 years. So definitely one of the things that I want to get UKGBC to do is really push through that message that when we're talking about the success of a site, we're talking about the outcomes that it's created. The second thing is that you can only create social value if you're asking the community properly what they want, and it is properly what they want, and it addresses their needs. having a situation where you're co-creating or co-designing with communities is incredibly hard to do. There's only a handful of people in the UK who I can think of as examples who are doing it properly. Social value forces you to do that. You can't create social value unless you've listened to those needs and you've co-created the community. So again, it's been great to hear all of the ideas and thoughts around that in the past day and a half as well. That's it from me. Thanks very much.